A very good morning to all the participants and welcome to this program of the School of the Ancient Wisdom. And as you are all aware, we are conducting this program on J. Krishnamurti, Freedom. And this particular topic today we're going to take up is, the title is Ambition. Before I go into the topic right away, I just want to make certain points which would give you the background of these talks. This particular subject, ambition, is not actually a talk. This is taken from one of his books called the Commentaries on Living. These commentaries on living are compilations from what are called as the notebooks of Krishnamurti. During the 1950s and 1960s, Krishnamurti was maintaining notebooks, noting down whatever incident or event or issue he wanted to address, and all these information drawn from those notebooks has been compiled into 3 or 4 volumes with the title Commentaries on Living. Usually, every topic, he gives a brief introduction, in the sense he dwells upon his observation of nature and what all is happening around him in the surroundings. If you can pick up one of these books called the Commentaries on Living, you will find that the introduction he gives before he actually goes into the topic, it's more like prose poetry. It's beautiful poetry, but in prose form, and it tells us about the sensitive nature of Krishnamurti and his deep awareness of the world around him, and how he is able to observe very small things, very minute issues which come to his notice, and then he goes on to discuss a topic based on his interaction with somebody. He doesn't normally name the person with whom he is interacting, but he would give an impression about that person also. Briefly, he would give an impression about that person and the question the person raises. So that's how the whole discussion or the writings of Krishnamurti begin when you see these commentaries on living. So this particular topic called ambition, he is discussing with a lady, and that lady has raised some interesting question. And that question is, in what way are you helping the world in this present crisis? She went on to ask more eagerly about the prevention of the we're trying to actually examine the question, examine the question in a very deep level, where it's expressed in the form of a question. For example, in reply to the question which I have mentioned earlier, he goes on by starting his writing and says, are not wars, the increasing disasters and miseries, the outcome of our daily life? Are we not, each one of us, responsible for the crisis? You see, these two questions are very profound. If you see, the answer is in the question itself. In a way, he is saying that the disasters, the misery, the suffering, the sorrow, the violence, which we see outside in the outside world is actually an outcome of our own daily life. One may feel that one is not promoting miseries or suffering or wars or violence, but actually being inattentive in our daily life, being not sensitive to things which we are seeing and which we are doing, we are contributing to these things unconsciously. We may not feel that we are contributing, but if you probe deeply into this, we find that any insensitive action on our part. See, for example, I don't know, we are still used to, and then we are getting used to more things now. Use of plastic, for example. Though in 1950s this was not a problem, but look at it from our perspective now, use of plastic or use of paper napkins and tissue papers. Now, we use them so unconsciously and so insensitively, and we add to this. Does it not add to the whole problem in this world? Are we not contributing to the misery, to the pollution, to the sorrow, to the suffering? Are we not contributing in our own way by being insensitive to things? So this is the question he is putting for us to examine. And that's why he says, are not wars, the increasing disasters and miseries, the outcome of our daily life? Are we not, each one of us, responsible for the crisis? Now look at the context also. This book was published way back in 1956 or so. It was he has written all these things after the Second World War and maybe a few years after the war. Now you see, at that time also, there was crisis. There was so much of misery. There was so much of suffering. Now compare that with our present day. Has it in any way come down? Or more and more miseries, much larger level of disaster. For example, see, unfortunately for all of us who are not directly involved, they become, or we might have heard yesterday on the TV, two disasters happened. One was the cyclone which hit Odisha and West Bengal. And the other was the aeroplane crash in Pakistan. You see, these things have become increasingly frequent, more and more frequent, because nature is responding to what we have done over several decades or centuries. Now it is trying to adjust itself or bring about some balance. We do not know exactly what how nature is going to respond to things. Have you see, if you look at it only as a news item, then we are actually contributing to the whole thing. Unless we become terribly sensitive, unless we become responsive and responsible for the things that are happening around us, there won't be any transformation in our life, in our daily life. Can we address our daily life so that we do not contribute in any manner whatsoever? In any manner whatsoever to the problem that is there? Are we willing to undergo small inconveniences, small problems, small issues, and then bring about changes in our life. So that is the issue that he is addressing. And he makes a very pertinent point when he says the future is in the present. The future will not be very different if there is no comprehension of the present. The future is nothing, so you can't think in terms of something out there in terms of either space or time. What we do in the present, we are actually contributing to the future. We are creating the future through our present actions. We are contributing to that. We are creating the future every moment of our life. So the future is in the present. And you can't expect a totally new future which is different from the present, because it is only a continuity in one way. As the traditional wisdom goes, no, you can't sow some kind of, say, neem seed and expect the mangoes to grow, isn't it? That's the traditionally we have been told. There are several versions of this in almost all the vernacular languages in India, where you seed and you sow a neem seed and you expect a mango tree to grow out of it. It doesn't happen. So what we do in the present directly contributes to what is happening is going to happen in the future. Then he goes on to say, is the world different from you? This has been the narrative of Krishnamurti for about 50, 60 years. Has been repeatedly. You are superficially, your desires, your temperament, your wants, your lifestyle, your place of birth, your background, your language, your culture, these things may differ. But deep down, if you look at it, self-centered. See, the foundation is the same. The basis on else is functioning is absolutely not different in any way. Very odd to you or very crude in one form. And your desire may appear to be very sophisticated or very refined to you. But if you look at it from a deeper point of view, it is that drive, it is that desire, it is that inner feeling for possession, for acquisition guiding us. There was a joke in the WhatsApp very recently when I was reading some message. I think this coronavirus has made us sensitive to the extent that at least we are not jealous of our neighbors anymore. We are not jealous of our neighbors because all of us are suffering. We are all in the same boat. Earlier, when things were okay, I was just looking at the neighbor and seeing what kind is enjoying and all that. That's no longer the thing now. We are all in the same boat and we are suffering. So you see, I think sometimes the reality does not really strike us hard enough. You see, anywhere in the world, there is turmoil, there is uncertainty, there is fear, there is some kind of, a very gloomy atmosphere. Nobody knows what really they are supposed to do or what they can do actually. So the world is not different from you, has not. After all, that's what it is. After all, that is what it is. We have built the structure of this society. It's only people like you and me, a few more millions, That's what we call it here, and different from me. I am a part of this society. I am a creator of this society. I am a contributor to this society, and I am a consumer from this society. And this is an ongoing thing. This is going on and on and on. And we are only creating more and more complicated structure and calling that as society. And some complacency has set in our minds thinking that I am different from the society.
Krishnapani ji, can't hear you. Hello?
Okay, okay. So, do you see the probing questions that Krishnamurti puts to us, which require very deep understanding and very deep pondering over it, so that we get to the reality of it. We get to the reality of the things. Otherwise, what happens is we will lose the, the thread of his, I don't know, slightly sharing part of it. Next. Yeah. So he says, as I said, to bring about a radical change in the structure, must not you and I fundamentally transform ourselves? This is another question. This is another question where he is again driving at the necessity for transformation at the individual level. Obviously, see, I cannot change anybody else. This might have become quite evident to most of us. Most of the people who have been married and who have been married for decades, a lot of effort might have been put in to somehow change the spouse. And finally, wisdom might have dawned on most of us, and we have now realized that we can't change anybody in this world. Neither the spouse, nor the children, nor your subordinates, nor your boss, nobody. So fundamentally, the transformation has to begin with oneself. That transformation has to come in me and in you. Otherwise, there is no transformation at all. And the important point he tries to make is that only such a transformation in the individual is going to bring about a radical transformation in the entire structure of the society. And then that is where the transformation of the world also begins. How can there be a deep revolution of values if it does not begin with us? Very rarely, Krishnamurti talks about values. He does not actually spell out what are all the values, but you can see that the core of his teaching is based around love and compassion. His basic thrust is on love and compassion. So for the time being, if we assume those to be the values he is addressing, a revolution has to take place in us where we understand the nature of the values which he is talking about. And that has to begin with you and me. To help in the present crisis, must one not look for a new idea? Must one look for a new ideology in a new economic plan? Look at the question again. He is putting a question where he is saying, should we look at a new ideology or a new economic plan? The reason behind this question is he's trying to probe and say an ideology or an economic plan is an external factor. An external factor is not going to bring about a great change internally. We have had all kinds of ideologies in this world. We continue to have them. We have all kinds of economic plans. And there are our people out there where they target the governments, they target the individuals, they target each other. And then we are in a situation where you do something, you are damned, and you don't do something, you are still damned. So you, whatever you do, you are bound to receive some kind of adverse response to it. And then there is somebody out there who is criticizing your ideology and proposing his own ideology, who is proposing his own economic plan, and he derides the economic plan which the people in power come up with. It's not a question of supporting one or opposing anybody. Fundamentally, the point is the crisis is not necessarily out there. The outer crisis, the impact of the outer crisis could be minimal, provided you are transformed inside. Like today, even with this pandemic going on, now people are no more talking about cures and vaccines and medicines and things like that. Now they're coming back to the same idea, and they are saying your personal immunity has to be improved. You have to boost your immunity. You have to transform in such a way that your immunity becomes strong. So you see, and is there any way of bringing about this immunity, boosting of this immunity outside? No, it is a strength which we have to build from inside. So the same thing he is talking about when he says, must one look for a new ideology, a new economic plan? Or must one begin to understand the conflict and confusion within oneself, which in its projection is the world? The confusion and conflict that is there in me, I am projecting it into the world and considering that the world is out there and different from me. Can new ideologies bring unity between man and man? In fact, the opposite is happening. In fact, exactly the opposite is happening. Whenever somebody comes with a new ideology, he is dividing mankind further. He is dividing humanity into more pieces. The fundamental problem lies within us and not outside. Then that's why he is answering that question and says, do not beliefs set man against man? Is this not a fact? It's a stark, naked fact which most of us refuse to see. I have a belief system of my own, and anybody who does not subscribe to that, I'll oppose that man. I'll fight that man. Go to any extent to put him down. Now, if I have a set of beliefs, I've either complicated and isolated, and even if somebody is willing to come into my fold, you need to be not, is divided into hundreds and hundreds of sects, hundreds and hundreds of divisions. You take any religion, the situation is the same. Therefore, he is addressing and saying that these ideological barriers our biases, our conclusions, our formulas are the problem, and we are not in touch with reality. Therefore, must we not put away our ideological barriers? For all barriers are ideological. And consider our problems not through the bias of conclusion and formulas, but directly without prejudice. You see, we have very conveniently adopted a mental state which somehow leads us away from the truth of sorrow and suffering, unless it is personal. Unless it is very personal, where I am directly involved in some event or some action or something has happened to me personally which has caused tremendous amount of sorrow or suffering. Anybody else outside me, I look at it as something like a mental construct only. Even there, I am not in direct touch with the sorrow and suffering. Therefore, he says we are never directly in relationship with our problems, but always through some belief or formulation. The irony of it is, even suffering, we try to convert it into a concept or an idea or a belief system and give some kind of an explanation. Does any explanation take away suffering?
Krishnapani ji, we've lost you again.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry for these glitches in between, I don't know, too much of usage of this Wi-Fi also may be creating the problem. So he makes a very pertinent point, which we need to ponder over. Problems bring us together, but ideas separate us. It's a very interesting statement, isn't it? The problem of COVID-19 has brought us together. But when we are trying to address that problem, we have come out with a million able to really perform action together. We're not able to directly address the problem together because we want to address those problems through an idea, through my own idea, instead of directly relating it to it. That's what is creating the problem. But unfortunately, we are stuck in a situation where the world is ruled by ideas only. The whole world is ruled by ideas. And obviously, each one has got his own idea about things. And therefore, we'll always be working through ideas only. And ideas separate us. They don't unite us. They don't bring us together. Only problems will bring us together, but ideas separate us. This is a very interesting statement. That's why I put it in dark blue color, so that we'll be in a position to ponder over these things. Now, the lady with whom is Krishnamurti is talking, she puts a question and says, I see so much suffering, so much misery, and I feel something must be done about it. Then in turn, Krishnamurti asks this question, are you really concerned, or are you merely ambitious to do something? And very interesting, the lady is very honest and frank. And she says, when you put it that way, I suppose I am ambitious to do something in which I shall succeed. Look at this answer. She has been very frank with Krishnamurti. He's putting a very, very beautiful question. See, look at the question. Are you really concerned, or are you merely ambitious to do something? Then that lady says, when you put it that way, I suppose I am ambitious to do something in which I shall succeed. You know, look at this. So ambition is something directly related to success. I want personal success, personal glory, personal benefit. Somehow I need to be superior to the whole thing, and therefore I am ambitious to do something. And therefore Krishnaji addresses and says, we want to be successful either directly for ourselves or for the ideal. This is another great deception of the mind. The mind creates an ideal and tries to think in terms of a way of deceiving ourselves, self-deception, where we think that we are putting the ideal before our own selfish motives. But this ideal has come out of our own selfish motives and our own belief system, our own ideologies, and the belief with which we have identified ourselves. The ideal is nothing more different from what we have identified ourselves with. The ideal is our own projection. It is the product of our mind, and our mind experiences according to our conditioning. So look at the point. Unless we are very careful, the mind can deceive itself and say, I have no selfish motive. I am working for a great ideal. That great ideal which you have put before yourselves is also a product of the mind. A product, something which has come out of the conditioning of one's own mind. It's one's own projection. It is no different from one's own selfish motive. We only give it a different shade, different color, or a different name for it. And therefore, again, he makes a very pertinent point and says, for these self-projections we work, we slave away and die. This may appear to be very controversial in certain cases. In several contexts, these kind of statements by Krishnamurti have led to a lot of debate and discussion. But the perspective, the state of being and the level from which he is talking is totally different from what we are used to. Right from the 1920s onwards, he was opposed to what we call as nationalism. In fact, during the Second World War, the government of the United States of America has banned all travel by Krishnamurti. He said, you are not supposed to travel anywhere. You have to stay where you are, and don't start giving all talks and lectures on against nationalism and things like that, because that would hamper the efforts of the war. Most of the wars, if you see, are fought on this ideal of nationalism. And that's why he says people are willing to become slaves and willing to die for that ideal, which is only a kind of self-projection. Now, these are issues which are not really to be debated or argued, but one needs to go deep into it. Now, that moment has actually come. When we are talking about the present crisis, the present pandemic, does it in any way recognize any national borders? Has it not proved once again that the whole world is a global village? And has it not again proved to us that we are so interdependent on each other that nationalities and races and ideologies, whether they are political or social or economic ideologies, they do not matter. This is the reality. So why is it that we are willing to become slaves to an ideology and die for it? Do we see that it's only a self-projection? Do you see that it's nothing different from a projection of your own self? it can also have the dimensions of collective things also. Collectively, we believe in something. Collectively, we believe in something, and therefore we act also collectively in some respects. But these are the questions which we need to probe very deeply. It is oneself that is important, actually or ideologically. Then the question, we come to this important question of why are we ambitious? Why is it that we are ambitious? Then that lady very interestingly says that if we were not, nothing would get done in the world. Ambition is another name for progress. Without progress, we would decay and wither away. Then again, Krishnamurti comes up with a few more questions now. He's again probing into it. He's not giving any answer to what that lady is saying. Actually, let us see where, through a question, in getting things done in the world, we are also breeding wars and untold miseries. Is this not a fact? While we are doing some action, there is an adverse reaction to it somewhere or the other. A greed of few people is a world war. A greed of few people causes misery somewhere. Is it not a fact? If you look at it, we see that this is a fact of our life, our daily life, but we don't want to address it. We don't want to look at it that way. And again, he is questioning, is ambition progress? Why do we want to succeed? Why do we want to be somebody? Why do we struggle to be superior? These are the questions one need to address. Because these are very important to us. These are very important to us because the basic factor is we are somehow unhappy about things as they are. We are somehow dissatisfied with our own life, with the life around, with things around. If it were to be true that we are blissfully ignorant about everything and we are happy, we would not turn to anybody for any discussion. We would not be bothered with Jiddu Krishnamurti or the Buddha or anybody else for that matter. Because there is a deep-seated disturbance, conflict, confusion, sorrow, misery, uncertainty, and unhappiness somewhere in us. That is what is bringing us together to probe into these matters. If you are otherwise happy, nobody will be drawn to examine these questions at all. Do children of 2 years or 3 years old or 5 years old, do they need all this nonsense? Jiddu Krishnamurti or webinars or somebody like me coming and talking about it? They don't, because they're essentially inwardly they live in the present and they are happy. But unfortunately, what we are calling it as growth and progress and development is causing this misery. So do you really think that ambition is progress? What is the need to think in terms of success? What is the need to think in terms of why should world? Why should I struggle to establish my own superiority in some form or the other? These are the questions which one should put to oneself. and see if you can come out with a new state of being. Not a new answer, not a new explanation, not an ideation or a creating of a new concept as such. What is more important is to come up with a new state of being. He goes on to question and says, why all this effort to assert oneself, whether directly or through an ideology or the state? Is not this self-assertion the main cause of our conflict and confusion? Again, I'll be drawing you to the same thought process where we need to think very deeply about these questions. Why do we want to be somebody? Why do we want to do something? He is not asking you not to do anything. He is not asking you to give up everything and stop doing everything. That's not the point. We are not supposed to come up with a counter question and ask him and saying that, do you mean to say that we should not put any effort at all? Do you mean to say that I should not do anything at all in this world? He's not talking about that issue at all. He's talking about a psychological factor which creates this confusion and conflict in oneself. It is that psychological factor which somehow wants one to be superior to the other, different from the other, unique from the other, somehow better than the other person. Somehow asserting oneself and establishing oneself as beyond many others. Does not this desire for success, for applause, bring conflict both within and without? Would being free of ambition mean decay? Is it stagnation to have no conflict? Does it mean that? Can you not work for the sake of working and be happy in what you are doing? Instead of looking for a result, instead of looking for an outward benefit, instead of looking at receiving appreciation and applause and affirmation from somebody else. If one person applauds you, that is not sufficient. You want 100 people to do it. If you're not happy about that, you want 1 million people to appreciate you. So you're going on strengthening this idea of me and myself and enlarging it to such an extent that the only possibility that comes out of it is conflict and confusion. Because every time you assert yourself, that is what happens. That is precisely what happens. Now, why are you equating not doing anything to simply stagnation, or why are you linking ambition to success? And why that you keep on doing something in order to keep yourself busy and not doing something? Why do you consider that to be decay and destruction? Is it really so? From a worldly point of view, look at it from a worldly point of view. Why do you want to be somebody? Is all the scientific activity, technological activity, all the so-called modern activities, are they really contributing to the conflict and confusion, or are they reducing the conflict and confusion? That also becomes important for us. There's so much of scientific and technological development. Has it actually reduced the conflict and confusion, or has it increased it? That. The answer to it is quite obvious. But we are not willing to accept it totally. We're not willing to accept it totally and say, no, partially it has done a lot of good, partially it has done bad. That is precisely what he has said earlier also. Your action, which appears to be good in one way, is creating misery in another way. So what is the great thing that has been done? You have done good for a few and caused misery to millions. Does it in any way compensate each other? Does it in any way set off against each other? Can you say that it's okay if a few million are suffering, if it is benefiting a larger portion of humanity, is it good? Is it only a question of numbers? Is it only a question of some nationalities, some nations which are rich and which are advanced in so-called technological advancement, or what we call as the way in which they are living? Their living standards have gone up. Is it only about that? Don't you see that in the so-called advanced nations and nations which are much more have better living facilities, is it not that you find more mental disturbance in those countries than in other countries where they are not there? These are all the questions one need to examine. These are all the questions one need to examine deeply, and we are not willing to do it. The whole problem is that we are not willing to do it because Krishnamurti has repeatedly said that it requires great amount of energy. Tremendous amount of energy and passion is required to address these questions, to ask these questions, to put these questions to oneself and live with that question. We have to practically live daily in and out every moment of our waking consciousness with these questions to come up with the right perspective. I would not call the right answer because there are no answers, there are no cut and dried answers to these things. You have to come with the right perspective. Like he says, we are so used to doing activity, it is like any other stimulant, it is like any other drug. For some people, a particular drug stimulates them and therefore they indulge in it. For most others, their activity itself is a stimulant, their activity itself is a drug. If you are asked to keep quiet, you may not be able to keep quiet. If you are asked that, sometimes that is why Krishnamurti used to put some very provoking of his very questions which I had to grapple with for a long time was, can you lead a totally purposeless life? This is a very interesting question. He said, can you lead a totally purposeless life? You can examine it in so many ways. Does it mean that you don't do anything productive in this world? Does it mean that you become a parasite on this society? Does it mean that you give up your vocation, your job, your earnings, your life? Or has it got any deeper meaning? Do we really know the true purpose of life in the first place? So all these questions come up. We need to grapple with these questions at our own level. At our own level. Maybe Krishnamurti could be a pointer. He may be the person who is making you put these questions to yourself. Maybe he is probing and provoking us to deeper levels of thinking and understanding. Context, we need to look at this. Is it a matter of numbers? Right in the beginning, when we started this program on the total freedom, when he has renounced the position of what he was called as the world teacher and the head of the organization called the Order of the Star in the East, he put a very pertinent question. He said, do you need an organization for 4 or 5 people? If only 4 or 5 people are truly interested in what I am saying, do I need an organization at all? Even then, at that time also, he was repeatedly questioned by journalists. They would ask him, how many followers you have? Is it the number that matters? Is it that there are, if I say I have 1 million followers and somebody has only 100,000 followers, am I 10 times better than him? So look at the way the mind can deceive itself. So it is not the number. It is not, that's why every time Krishnamurti used to say that close friends, two concerned friends talking to each other. You don't require more than two. For a dialogue, you need two people, not beyond that. And that's what he said throughout his life. He said it's only a dialogue between two people. You and I are concerned people, and we are trying to meet with the same intensity, at the same level, at the same time. Then there is that possibility of that understanding dawning. Otherwise, it's not going to help you. It's not really going to help you. So look at the way he is analyzing by putting several questions on this idea of ambition, on this whole idea of ambition, how it is operating. When we are aware of the false as false, when we are aware of this false as false, does it bring death? To be aware that ambition in any form, whether for happiness, for God, or for success, is the beginning of both within and without, mean the end of all action, the end of life. Seeing the false as false. It does not mean decay or death. Being aware of the fact that ambition, being aware of the fact that ambition is the source of conflict. It is the beginning of conflict within and without. Does it mean, why is it that we are clever and ambitious? Is not to avoid what is. We are unwilling to address the what is, see the what is. Is not this cleverness really stupid, which is what we are? Why are we so frightened of what is? As I said in the beginning, most of his writings or even talks, they are actually questions and questions and questions. He's continuously putting questions, continuously addressing a person to probe into himself, to probe into oneself. So this ambition is actually an urge in us to avoid what is. I am not happy with what is. I am unwilling to actually face what is. When I'm unwilling to face what is, obviously what happens? I create an ideal, I create an ambition, I create a goal, I create a purpose, and I work towards it. In the process of working, I'll trample on so many people, I'll tread on so many toes, I'll create so much of disturbance in the process. And do we not see that happening? Suppose I am a politician and I am somehow hell-bent on winning the election. Don't you see the kind of violence I create? Don't you see that I do not even mind killing a few people in somehow achieving my goal? That could appear like an extreme case. That could appear like an extreme case, but we are equally doing the same thing at our own level within the ambit of my own field of operation. Don't we see this happening in offices? One working against the other. I am not happy about somebody getting a promotion or likely to get a promotion, so I'll try to spoil his chances of being promoted. I'll try to influence so many people so that I supersede so many people and get a promotion. Is this any way different from what a politician is doing? Don't we see the connection that at each level we are behaving in the same manner? Somebody appears to be behaving in the same manner with larger dimensions. More people are involved, more violence is involved, more of effort is involved. Whereas in my own small corner in my own life, I'm a small clerk in an office and I don't do the work properly and I become corrupt and I start fleecing money from people for doing small favors. Am I in any way different from a murderer or somebody else? It's only a matter of degree. It's only a matter of degree. But essentially, it is the same thing. If we are put in that place, we would maybe behave worse than the politician. Most of us might have remained good because we never had a great opportunity to do damage. We never had a great opportunity to create bigger problems in this world. That doesn't make one good. It is the same ambition which is driving, and this urge for this ambition is actually nothing but avoidance of what is. That is the point he is trying to make, and asking us to examine this very carefully. Asking us to examine this very carefully. What is the good of running away if whatever we are is always there? Can we run away from ourselves? We may temporarily succeed in avoiding certain things and escaping from certain things. But can I jump out of myself and run away somewhere? I'll be carrying my own mind, my own prejudices, my own fears, my own anxieties, my own desires. So I continue to be what I am wherever I go. Whatever I do. Unless there is a basic transformation, a radical transformation. Otherwise, we are going to still breed conflict and misery. So any activity away from what is bound to bring sorrow and antagonism. Conflict is the denial of what is coming back to his fundamental question. Can we live with what is? Can we see what is in the first place in its totality? If I realize by looking at myself that I am stupid, can I stay with that stupidity? Can I look at it completely with attention without trying to condemn it or justify it or accept it or reject it or justify or give an explanation to it in any form? Because he says, in that attention to what is, there is no conflict. So whether it is ambition or your desire to become something or be something, achieve something, from a psychological point of view, it is only going to bring about more conflict and more misery. Again, I would like to emphasize, this is not a matter for debate or discussion or taking sides and arguing one way or the other, because that won't lead anywhere. This is a dialogue between two concerned people who are very seriously interested in looking at life from a deeper perspective. That's why it is called as a samvada. In the traditional system, we have what is called as a samvada. Samvada is a dialogue in which both of us are responding or resonating equally. We are resonating to the same frequency. A vada, it becomes a dispute or an argument, and that will lead to further violence, where it will lead to what we call it as vivada. So this has to be perceived. This fact has to be perceived. Unless it's perceived, any amount of doing anything in this world is not going to really help. However much we may be looking at this whole subject of the self and spirituality and the Atman and the Brahman or something else, it's not going to really matter, because there is this conflict and we are unable to see the truth of matters. Because we are unable to see the truth of the matter, we will be always in conflict only. We'll always be in conflict. Do we see this for a fact? And finally, he says, our conflict becomes more and more complex and insoluble because we do not face what is. There is no complexity in what is, but only in the many escapes that we seek. I really do not want to further elaborate or comment on this. I want you to ponder over this very carefully and see the truth of it. As Krishnaji says, he does not want to agree or disagree with him. And he goes on to say in several cases that I may be wrong and you may be right. What all I am saying may be totally wrong also. But please examine that also. Please examine that how it is wrong. Please examine the whole situation now without taking sides, without coming to conclusions about right or wrong. So again, I'll just read this and close it. Our conflict becomes more and more complex and insoluble because we do not face what is. There is no complexity in what is, but only in the many escapes that we seek. With this, I will stop, and I think we have another 10 minutes or so for some questions. I see some messages on the chat. Let me address them. Let me just see what are the observations. There's one from Ms. Sunita. Today's war and pandemic validates that the world is one, but how are each one of us responsible? Without ambition, can there be progress? In the over 60 years since JK commentary, can the progress of individual or society be negated? Can there be ambition without desire for acknowledgement, without desire for applaud? I think you have answered it in your own way. It very much validates that the world is one. There's no dispute about it. But don't we see that in some way we are responsible for it? Have we not changed our lifestyle over the past 40, 50, 60 years? What were luxuries in the 1960s have become necessities today. What were really, not very important, seem to have become very important today. So are we not in some way responsible for this? Now let us not take very big issues. How many of us have really stopped using plastics? Is it necessary for the Bangalore municipality to impose a ban on plastics? Is it necessary for somebody from outside to impose conditions on your life? Or should we not become intelligent enough to understand and change our life? Now, for example, we are getting so many messages saying that please don't think that this lockdown is going to remove the virus completely from the environment. Is it not? It is one way, a very partial response to the problem. Suppose the lockdown is lifted, does it mean that we can congregate in thousands wherever we want? So that's the responsibility I'm talking, and therefore each one of us are definitely responsible. And not only that, we are responsible to a much greater, effect than we normally think we are. Each one of us may think that I am only contributing a little bit to the problem. But a little bit of contribution by a billion people, what could it lead to? If a 1 gram of wastage by a billion people, billion grams will lead to how many tons of wastage? How many thousands of tons of wastage? How can we absolve ourselves from that responsibility? We are definitely responsible. Now, without ambition, can there be progress? He has already put this question. He said, is it very much necessary to be ambitious and greedy and look for personal benefit and then only talk in terms of progress? Should I progress at the cost of others? Is it not the law of jungle where each one is looking for his own this thing and then avoiding everybody else, or willing to destroy or kill or do anything to everybody else? This is a great debate going on. This is a great debate. It's not that people are not talking about it, but do you see the actual fact of it? Do you see the actual fact of it? The world was much more beautiful before mobile phones and before WhatsApp and before Zoom. The world was much more peaceful in some ways. So has this progress, this technological progress, this material progress, is it really benefiting? Or should we not think in terms of the material progress matching with your psychological progress also? Psychologically, we are still insecure. Psychologically, we are still facing problems. Psychologically, we are still violent. Psychologically, we are still greedy. Has material prosperity reduced our greed or increased our greed? These are the questions which we need to address. No, see, the progress which is happening because of our own ignorance or of our own knowledge or whatever it is something which can't be stopped. Is something which can't be really stopped. Way back in 1982, 83, a few years before his death, Krishnamurti said, computers are going to take over life. By that time, nobody even knew about a personal computer. When he was talking about this, because he was discussing with scientists and technologists and the people at the vanguard, people who were at the forefront of all development in the US, when he was talking to them, he said that computers are going to take over most of the activities of humanity. Then what is the humanity going to do? Don't we see the correlation? Have we our life from a material point of view has become very easy. But did that make us more productive? Did that make us spend more time with what we are supposed to do? See, earlier, somebody who didn't have water connection would walk about 2 miles or a mile and then come back with a pot of water. For him, that water becomes precious. Now you have provided a water connection to him. He is now saved about 1 hour time. Is that 1 hour being used productively now? Has he in any way developed his own faculties to be a better contributor to the society by this saving of 1 hour? How much time are we wasting on this idiot box? The biggest beneficiaries of this pandemic are the TVs, channels. And Doordarshan happens to be a very big beneficiary. It has got more than 100 million viewers for Ramayana and Mahabharata. But it's only entertainment. We don't seek the essence of the Ramayana or the Mahabharata. So it's important to pose these questions and answer, not exactly answer, but look at the whole situation. Look at the actual fact of why do you need acknowledgement? Is it because you have been conditioned that way from childhood? Is it that right from our school days, we were given stars or grades or numbers or ranks, and therefore we have been conditioned to such an extent that we think that acknowledgement, appreciation, affirmation, and all these things are natural? Did we not change the system now? In most of the states, they have changed from ranks to grades. Because some psychologists said that these ranks are creating a lot of stress in the children. So don't talk about ranks. Anybody who gets between 90 and 91% and 100%, you call him as A++ or something. So see, these are questions what one need to probe and see what is the reality. The fact of the matter is that people are more miserable. With so much of prosperity around, so much of wealth around, so much of material conveniences around, we are still more miserable than what our fathers or grandfathers were. It's not a mere comparison. Has it in any way reduced your stress? Has it liberated you to be more compassionate, to be more loving? Or have we become more greedy and more self-centered? These are the questions one need to address oneself. Not seek answer from Krishnamurti or somebody, but look at it from that point of view and we can see the reality. Then the question from Beena Mirchandani, the need for ambition is part of our conditioning, which again comes from societal values, which is us again. It seems like a cycle which we need to break as individuals through thought, feeling, complete without needing outside approval or how we are living our lives. Will this then change the stupid values of the society has? Yeah, this is, I think, your response to Sunita ji. It's one way correct. Now, see, it has to begin with me. Now, we used to have a lady, I think you know about, you might have heard about Rukmini Arundale. She was a very famous lady, dancer, and she was the one who brought these Devadasis out of their slavery, and then she made these dance forms as true arts in the 1920s and all. She used to travel all over the world, and I had an opportunity to meet her way back in 1978 or so. And she told me that whenever she is in some Western countries, it was very common in those days, in 1940s, 50s also, it was more prevalent. Smoking and drinking was more prevalent in the Western society. And obviously, if you go to such a gathering, where people would offer you a small cigarette or they would offer you a drink. And generally, these Indians seem to be very diffident and sorry, I don't drink. As though they are very apologetic for not drinking. Then she said, I started a trend by saying, I don't drink and I am sorry for you that you drink. When somebody used to offer a cigarette, she would say, I don't smoke. I am sorry that you smoke. Don't be apologetic about it. If you have a value system, if you have a conviction in what you are doing is right, stand up to it and bring that change in the society. So that's how it can change. But if you want to, move along with the society and think, will I be embarrassing myself or will I be becoming a problem in a high-fi society and high-flying society and then there will be a problem? No, it need not be. So it is you that matters. you have to take a stand and say that, no, I don't do it. I don't indulge in this. Let the whole world indulge in it. I don't do it. I am not a part of that society which indulges in these things. So that's that is the way to move about, and then say, you see, that was an example which came to my mind because it made a great impact on me. I was just about 20 or 21 at that time. And it made a great impact. And I said, yeah, this is one way of living up to your ideals.
That's true.
Because that's what we have been told.
I just want to tell you there are more questions on top.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, there are more.
No, I have missed them out because unfortunately I had to reconnect once or twice. Can you just read them?
Yeah. There's one which says ideology to change society to more egalitarian may be a good thing.
No, see, what do you mean by egalitarian society? See, the great French Revolution was started on this basis only. Isn't it? The French Revolution was started on fraternity and equality and liberty. And during the revolution, several of the people whom they considered as bourgeois or the elite, they were killed. Then the middle class became the rich. There's still some lower class. The lower class reacted against them and they killed them. So see, the question is not hold on to the ideology, but hold on to the fact of equality and live with that equality.
Yeah.
It is living with the equality and myself treating everybody as equal and the same way being courteous to them, being good to them. That is that more important, or the ideology of equality is more important? If you make equality as an ideology, then you will not allow anybody to progress. Isn't it? What does equality mean? Equal in money? Equal in status? Equal in what way? So the equality is not out there, but the equality is in me as to how I treat people, how I address people, how I look at people. That becomes more important and not the ideology.
Right.
Okay.
There's one more question. We are not ourselves now. The media dictates our collective thinking and masks the reality. We can neither throw it nor keep it. Perhaps stronger power of discrimination is needed.
Very much so, very much so. Why can't we throw it away? Why is it that we are stuck? I think we can definitely throw it away. Don't subscribe to it at all.
Yeah.
Don't watch the TV. As I said, a good friend of mine from the School of Ancient Wisdom, he became an inspiration for me, and I don't have a TV for the past 3 years now. So I don't know what is happening in the news channels. I am blissfully ignorant. I get a newspaper for crossword puzzle and Sudoku. So I'm not bothered about it because it's not really helping. You're only filled with the ideas of somebody else, and there is no original thinking and original feeling also. They have to go together. An original thinking and an original feeling of that love and compassion have to be in us, and we can definitely throw this. Don't look at a stronger this thing from outside, but it should be from inside. It should be from inside, which should make us strong and stand up to things. You have to stand up to things. In certain respects, when you say that I don't subscribe to it, I don't subscribe to it. That's all. It's as simple as that. I don't subscribe to that way. Whatever may be the temptation, whatever may be the issue at hand, I don't yield to certain things because I have the conviction of truth in that matter. It's not a question of belief. You have to be convinced about the truth of it because you have seen the truth and therefore the truth will liberate you. Yes.
There's another question from the same person. Many times, ideal is a deception of mind.
Yes.
One way, my work to promote solar power is good to the society. Other hand, it is a business, cannot be denied. Can this be a conflict?
No, see, it is a conflict in one way. And it is not a conflict in another way. In the sense, see, is your ideal to provide solar power to everybody? Let us take that as the ideal. But why bother about the ideal? Can you build a business model where you are limiting your profit, where you are convinced about the good it will do to the society, and offer it at a very competitive price to whoever can afford it? I know about the solar power business when governments used to sign power purchase agreements at the rate of 17 rupees, 18 rupees per unit. And it has come down to now 2 rupees, 2.5 rupees, 1 rupee now. There is reverse bidding. There's all kinds of things that are happening. Okay. So in one way, the greed of a few people has done good to the society where it has drastically brought down the cost of most of these technologies. In finance, we have a term called as arbitrage. This arbitrage is nothing but the greed of a few people, which will ultimately drive the market towards efficiency and giving the best price to the consumer. So if we are in that area, obviously we should be in a position to survive by providing the best possible service at the cheapest price and still be in business. So you can bring about a model which helps you to do that. If it doesn't, there could be so many other things one can do. So if it's a conflict, if you look at your own personal benefit in the sense that your basic idea is that I need to make so much of profit, and therefore I am going to do it. I have the same conflict. I am also in a kind of business of my own where this conflict arises. But I have severely restricted to such an extent that I don't get indebted, I don't borrow money, and I do business on my own terms in a very limited manner, which keeps me happy and which gives me enough to sustain.
Krishnapati, now the questions are, you can see them.
Yeah.
There's one after mine, I think you can
okay. I think that is a response from the School of Ancient Wisdom to Sunita ji. Your ambition and you are not separate from it. When once you start seeing this objectively, you start to pursue it, attaching great importance to your pursuit. Based on this, you derive satisfaction. To come to a conclusion immediately that we would be nothing without ambition is a work of the mind that make quick judgments or think is in parts. I think that's correct in one way. See, it is the play of the mind. It's the mind which is playing a game, thinking that if you are not ambitious in your life, you are nobody or you can't do anything. But that may not be true. See, we need to go into this very deeply because this was a struggle, personal struggle for a long, long time. Way back in the 1970s, when I was a student, I was reading the works of Swami Vivekananda. One of the statements he made, I could not understand and I could not grapple or accept it for several years. He made a statement and said that when there is no desire for the result or fruit of one's action, your work will be more efficient and effective. This is totally in contradiction to what we are trained to think. Swami Vivekananda was talking about what is Nishkama Karma and what does the Bhagavad Gita preach to us. And he made an additional statement by saying that you can be much more efficient and much more effective if your focus is not on the result and the fruit of that action, but on the action itself. Now, after several years, it made a lot of sense to me later that the moment your concern is the fruit or the result, your action is limited and partial and directed only towards that result. If your action were to be really effective and efficient by focusing on the action, possibly the result would be much more than what you have normally expected also. The result would have been much more than what we normally expect from that. So are we not limiting ourselves by expecting a small result only? So you see the problem. So ambition is actually a hurdle. Focusing our attention on the action, putting all our effort and passion into the action brings out a better result than what we can even imagine. What happens in most of the cases is we have desires without action. We want our desires to be fulfilled without action. That is why I mentioned sometimes in the School of Ancient Wisdom in some of the programs where there's one very good author called Ravi Ravindra. This Nishkama Karma, he reversed it and said, most of us have Nishkarma Kama, desire without doing anything. I want all my desires to be fulfilled without making any effort. So the mind can play this kind of game also, where I have great ambitions, but I'll not put commensurate effort. That becomes a hurdle. So forget about the ambition part of it, the desire part of it, the fruit part of it, the result part of it, put that aside and all your attention on doing the work in the best possible manner. That gives more satisfaction, more happiness and more meaning to that work. Yeah.
I think that's it, Krishnapani ji.
Okay, thank you. I think we have exceeded our time also.
We have, but
yeah.
Shall I ask everybody about this?
Yes. Yes, please.